Well, good morning, church. It is good to see all of you here this morning. Some faces we haven't seen in a while are back with us, and that is so exciting. A couple for health reasons, a couple from just traveling, and man, it's just nice to see our brothers and sisters when we gather here together. You know, to that note, we got a unique opportunity of, instead of meeting on Wednesday night last week, which was untraditional, I know, we met on Saturday, and we had maybe close to 30 people there serving a bunch of foster kids and calling it church. And that's exactly what it was. You know, these kids who are going through a very difficult season of life, we were able to step in and provide a little bit of hope and a little bit of joy and fun and good times in the middle of was probably a very difficult season. And that's not just to pat ourselves on the back. That's because that's what the church is. That's what Christ is in this world. And I was so excited to be able to do that with so many of you yesterday. It's just a joy to me that this is becoming a regular part of who we are. We're seeing more and more rhythms of serving other people. In fact, you might have noticed when you got here today that there's a new infrastructure on our church grounds. There's a box right out here that's been planted to be started to be stocked with food and healthcare supplies and stuff for those in the community who need it. They'll be able to start coming by and grabbing those things in a couple of weeks when we get it finished here. But man, it's just good. I got to stop. I get excited, but this is pretty much my sermon for next week, so I kind of got to hold myself back a little bit. Instead, we'll open up with this. I imagine that many of you are familiar with the show Breaking Bad. Okay? Now, this is not an endorsement, okay? We live in the real world. There are real shows that are very popular, and I imagine most of us have seen it. It comes with its flaws. It comes with its warning labels, but it was an extremely popular show for a long time, and for good reason. The story, the plot line, the character arcs are extremely interesting in this show. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's about a brilliant but underachieving high school chemistry teacher who finds out that he has terminal cancer. Now, frightened by the idea of leaving behind a wife, a disabled son, and a newborn daughter, he decides that he's going to use his vast chemistry knowledge to make drugs. To make drugs and have them sold so that he can make enough money to leave his family when he passes on, that they will be taken care of. So at first he starts as this really innocent, almost awkward, middle-aged man stepping into this world of drugs and crime and so on. But as the episodes go on, you see that his very core identity and his personality, it changes by participating in this new world that he's stepped into. You know, he thought that he could simply make the drugs, not even sell the drugs, not use the drugs, just make the drugs, and be able to step aside, collect the money, and be completely unstained from that evil world, and that he could move on with his life and his family would be taken care of, and everything would be okay. But really, at the end of the series, he becomes this feared criminal drug lord. You know, spoiler alert, but I think he's about 10 years old now, so that's on you, not me. But on top of that, just to kind of get into the details a little bit more of this example, when he's in this criminal alter ego, I guess, he goes by the name Heisenberg. Now, if you've dug into it a little bit more, you might know that Werner Heisenberg was a German scientist from the 1920s who developed famously this theory that there is no pure science experiment. That every objective science experiment that is had is influenced by the scientists who are doing it. That you can't just set up an experiment in a lab and expect it to run unencumbered. That the environment around it influences that very experiment, whether they want it to or not. And so in this show, this Heisenberg, this character, he thinks he can supply these drugs while staying completely pure and untouched by his objective experiment. But the environment of it still shapes him into someone different, into someone new, into someone worse off. And that's why this story is so fascinating to so many of us, because it's not just fiction, okay? That's how our real lives work. Whether it's good or bad, the things that we do and the environments we find ourselves in, they mold us and they shape us. Who we hang out with, the shows we watch, the hobbies we participate in, they all play a role in who we become as people. You know, even things that we have less control over, like our families or our work environments, they're still at work forming us into certain types of people. They influence our hearts, okay? Whether we know it or not, they influence our hearts. And as my dad pounded into me and my brothers, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. I think under your bulletin today, I talked about how memorizing Scripture has always been a hard one for me. I knew this one. The 1, 2, 3 helped, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, excuse me. But out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The things we put into our heart eventually will flow out of us through speech, through actions, through personality, or whatever. What we put in will eventually be what we put out. Here's another brief example of that. And you might have heard me, those of you who went to our technology or tech-savvy parenting seminar a couple years ago might remember this. But psychologists are discovering that we as a people are having less of a tolerance for boredom than we used to. Did you know that? Like sociological phenomenon, we cannot handle boredom like we used to. You know, when things get slow, we tend to really kind of lash out and seek some sort of stimulation at all. And at first you might think, hey, like that's not a bad thing, fighting boredom. Like, what's the problem with fighting boredom? And there's nothing inherently wrong with fighting boredom, but the implications of this are not good, okay? For example, we're finding that kids can't seem to get through their homework, especially that homework that feels more like busy work, okay? That it's just the repetition. They're having a hard time finishing it and sitting through it and doing it, and their grades are slipping. Adults are having a hard time sitting through business meetings, and maybe that's you. Maybe you experience that. People are quitting their jobs rather than doing the mundane tasks of stocking shelves. They are just quitting because they can't sit through the mundane and the boredom. And you know what one of the main causes of this that they're finding is? Smartphones. Smartphones. Just having at our fingertips all this constant access to stimulation and entertainment. You got a boring commercial coming on TV between your Ohio State game? You scroll Facebook, right? You're saying the line's too long at Target? You play Angry Birds, if that's still on your phone, okay? Right? The sermon goes a little too long, you check the weather before you leave. You know, I know what you're saying. And whenever we get bored, we have instant access to stimulate our brains, to entertain us, to engage us in some way. And so it has prevented the part of our brain that deals with boredom from being exercised, from being used, for being strengthened. And so when we get in these bored moments, we physiologically can't handle it because that part of our brain is being underutilized, underdeveloped, underexercised. Okay, and it's creating these society-wide problems. Isn't that interesting? You know, when you open up Facebook, when you open up the Sudoku app on your phone, you don't think it's going to change you. You sit there and you're like, I'll play through this for a little while and then I'll turn it off and I'll still be me, right? I'm just using it and I'll put it away and I'll still be me. It's like using a hammer, right? A hammer does not change me. I can pick up a hammer, nail down some nails, and am uninfluenced by the hammer, I like to think, okay? Right? But we've got to realize, folks, that there are less and less of those things in the world that simply and purely do not influence us. Everything from our toys to our environment shape us. They influence us whether we realize it or not. There are consequences, and there are things for everything that we do. Everything around us is beginning to shape us. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? We can be shaped by good things as well as the bad things. We can choose to fill ourselves with, to utilize, to surround ourselves with beautiful things, so we become more flourishing people. And that's why the church is so important, right? This is our fourth and penultimate sermon of our Gathered series, where we're discussing why the church is so important, why the church is so beautiful, and why it matters that we gather together as the people of God to worship Him. And this topic that we've been on so far this morning, it fits perfectly in this idea. Right? It fits perfectly here. While we're discovering new things about how we are influenced every day, God has known them since the beginning, okay? God is not discovering, oh, look, humans, they're really influenced by these little subtle things that we didn't notice before. We're discovering that. God already knew it, and He's been using it for a really long time. When God calls people, He makes sure and calls them into a community where they can be collectively blessed and collectively formed and molded and shaped into the people He wants us to be, right? He doesn't just call you and stick you out there. He calls you into a people because we know that we need people to be shaped together. When God calls a person, he invites them also to partake in practices and activities that will mold them into the kind of people he wants us to be. Okay? He doesn't just say, hey, show up and obey. He says, hey, do some of this, do some of that, and it will help you become the person I know you will be, the fullest and abundant life of what you can be. This is particularly evident in the Old Testament, where God designs all sorts of rituals and festivals for them throughout the year. Everything from the Sabbath at the end of the week to the all these different things, the year of Jubilee and all these other festivities that they would do, the Passover. They have these regular formative practices to keep them closer to God. I appreciate Dave's last song and Wyatt's scripture reading today. Remember, they recited that line, that Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. They said, keep it on your forehead, keep it on your fence post, because this will shape you. Say it every day. Okay, they had these rituals to keep them in there. We've been studying the book of Exodus since July on our Sunday night class, and it's actually being wrapped up tonight. This is our last Exodus class. So if you want to know how it ends, you're welcome to join us at 7 o'clock. Okay? But one of the weeks we looked at the institution of the Passover. We know the Passover, right? We know the story from Exodus. And it's interesting that even before the Passover event happens, even before the Passover event happens, before the lambs were slaughtered, before death enters the city, God instructs Moses on how Israel would hold these annual ceremonies replicating this event forever. Before it even happens, he says, hey, do this and this and this for generations to come, so you always remember what happened here tonight. Before it even came to pass, God wanted it to be a regular rhythm in their life that they would relive and relive and relive and be shaped by for generations. Even those who were born thousands of years after that Passover moment would be shaped by that event because they could partake in it every year at the Passover. Why? Well, Exodus tells us. God says, obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. Then the people bowed down and worshiped. See, even centuries after this mighty act by God, his people would be influenced by it because it lives on in their practices. And it very literally shapes their lives in the way they think, in the way that they live. Now you might think, well, a lot of good it did them. Israel didn't turn out so great, okay? If this is what we need to focus around to help us become better people, more faithful people, well, it might not work so great because Israel, they had all these ceremonies, they had all these rules, they had all these rituals, and they fell through the cracks quite a bit. But did you know that in the text, a majority of the time that Israel is in rebellion, when they're off disobeying God, not paying attention to God, we're told in the Bible most of those times that they had already begun neglecting those ceremonies. Did you know that? Look at the prophets and stuff especially. It began with them not observing the Sabbath. That wasn't the result. That was the first step. It began with them not practicing the Passover. It began with them not practicing the year of Jubilee. And then they would start failing to live righteous lives and failing to obey God. Without those forces and those rhythms guiding them towards godly living, all they had were the forces of the world, pushing them in an opposite direction, right? When you cut out these things that God is using to shape us, all they had were the forces of the world, pushing them in a different direction. They needed their worship to shape them as a people. And guess what? Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. We might not be ethnic Israel. We might not be required to observe the Passover or the Sabbath, but we are still the people of God, called to gather together to worship God, and in doing so, partake in activities that are meant to shape us as faithful disciples. In that root, it's the same. We are now the people of God called to gather together to partake in activities that will shape us into faithful disciples. okay? The practices we do here every week, the rituals, the liturgy. And we don't use that word very much. When we say liturgy, we probably think maybe some Catholics and creeds and stuff, but the regular practices we do week in and week out, everything from the invitation to the opening prayer, that's technically, by definition, liturgy. But these different things, they're meant by God to develop us into faithful people for the other 6 days of the week. They're not an end-all in this 1 hour on Sunday morning. They're meant to shape us to go outside of these walls and to be faithful people for the rest of the week. And so let's look at some of these. Okay? Even just starting off, gathering here, being here together on a Sunday morning at the genesis of a new week. I am teaching myself by being here that every day of every week belongs first and foremost to God. That is what I teach myself when I show up here on Sunday morning. That every day of every week belongs first and foremost to God. I sit down surrounded by my brothers and sisters to assure my soul that I'm not alone. Okay? I know some of us here, we go home to an empty house. Or we go home to a very solitary office. Or we go out into the world where we feel like we're the only one who thinks like we do, who lives like we do, right? It can be a lonely world out there. But when I gather here, I assure my soul that I am not alone, that I am a brother, that I'm a sister, that I'm a child of a father. And that shapes me. Or how about when I sing? When I sing, I practice giving praises and offering thanksgiving back to God. Right? Giving my good and loving Father praises and thanksgiving. And it combats against my sometimes petty heart. It combats against the coldness that at least my heart so often wants to harbor. Right? And it's a practice that I'm doing each and every week to say, no, I might be petty. I might be cold. I might be bitter about some things in my life or in the world or whatever. But when I'm here, I am forcing myself to practice what it's like to praise and to offer thanksgiving. And that shapes me. And that forms me and it molds me. I also witness how these God-given artistic abilities like singing can and should be used to turn around and glorify God. Right? My wife's an artist. She does that to glorify God. We sing. That's a gift. It's beauty that God has given us. We can sing for the world, but we see here, we witness how we can use those gifts for God. Or how about every week, I take that piece of bread out of the tray and I break it. It's a lot harder now because they're smaller, but I still do. Even sitting in the back there, I take my little square and I break that square because that's important to me, that it breaks. Okay? I taste that broken bread. I taste that tart fruit of the vine, and I recall that flesh was broken and that blood was spilt because someone loved me and they found me valuable. And I don't just hear that, I taste it and I hold it and I feel it. And the repetition of that every week causes me to believe that it's true, that maybe I am loved, that maybe I am valuable. And when I go back out into the world, or the world tells me, hey, you are not loved, you are not valuable, I have hundreds and hundreds of trips to this table that reinforces to me what truth is. I tried to do a little bit of math. I've been baptized 16 years now. I think I have close to 800 trips to the table, 800 breakings of bread, 800 tastings of that tart fruit of the vine. And it reminds me, regardless of what the world says, that I am loved and I am valuable. Not to mention, I also see other people taking that same supper. And it reminds me, it teaches me, forms me to think that maybe they're worth breaking for too. That maybe an opportunity might come where I will be broken for them and they're worthy of that too, right? When I write that check, okay? You know, for the rest of the world, it might just seem like a pen scribbling on a piece of paper, but that regular writing and folding and dropping, I teach myself that the money on that paper is not mine. That none of it is mine, that it all belongs to God, and I have to be willing to give it up and to give it back to He who made it and He who truly owns it. And I practice that over and over and over again. Are y'all seeing how these small, repetitive actions can have these widespread ethical implications? That if we tune into them, this should apply to our daily life. That writing checks on Sunday morning, that breaking bread on Sunday morning, that singing and listening and gathering and sitting can teach me to be a certain kind of person on Monday through Saturday. When the words of God are proclaimed aloud to listening ears, when fallen human efforts combine with divine words, we rehearse the story of God in our world. The stories of Exodus, the stories of things, they become real again right here before us. And as I experience the retelling and the rehearsing of this story, I'm more enabled to locate the story of God in my own life. When I hear it here, week after week after week, I'm better able to see and discover the story of God at work in the world around me as well. And there's obviously so many more of these that we could put up here. But the worship service of the assembled saints is about so much more than just looking pious, okay? It's even about more than just worshiping God. It's forming you. It's a training in righteousness. It's a nourishment for faithfulness. It's the soil for godly ethics to grow out and into the world outside these walls. Now, of course, we don't always recognize the power that these small actions have, right? These liturgies, these acts of worship, whatever you want to call them. We don't always remember or tune into how deep they can go. We throw the implications for this up on the screen. I can think it could be easy to think, well, dadgum, I don't think about song leading that deeply. I don't think about writing a check that deeply. That's a little bit deeper down the well than I normally tend to go. Or maybe we think to ourselves, well, y'all might be being formed that way, but I'm a daydreamer, okay? I'm not getting all that out of this because I'm daydreaming and stuff. And, as my 91-year-old Mimi confessed to me over dinner one time secretly that she daydreams through just about every sermon she hears, And you know what? I got good news. That's okay. That's okay. It doesn't, maybe it doesn't matter as much as you think it does. Okay? Now, obviously, we want to be paying attention. A greater awareness allows for greater fruit. Okay? It's important. We should put in the effort to focus, pay attention. But what have we been saying through this whole sermon? Our environment shapes us whether we know it or not, right? Our environment shapes us whether we know it or not. The things that you partake in, the habits you do over and over again, whether you realize it or not, will shape the way that you see the world and will shape the way that you live into it. Okay? You might daydream, but you're still being formed by what you do here. And that's why it's so important to be here. Whether our hearts are sullen and we don't feel like it or whatever, it still is an important practice. You remember the Karate Kid? See, I did Breaking Bad for the people more interested in 2010s and Karate Kid. This is 39 years old. Sorry. Okay? The Karate Kid. This young man, he discovers that the local janitor is a karate master. And he asks him for training. And so the Mr. Miyagi, what does he have him do? Yeah, wax the car. Paint the fence. And does he mop? Was that the third one? I meant to look it up. Paint the house, too. Okay, it's a different painting, I see. Okay, paint the fence, paint the house, wax the car. And he goes, he does these things over and over again. And eventually, the young man, he gets frustrated. Hey, I wanted you to teach me karate. What do you do? Why? I don't want to do your chores week after week after week. You're manipulating me. You're using me. I'm not getting anything out of this. And then what does Mr. Miyagi show him? Yeah. That through those chores, through those seemingly insignificant moments, his muscles and his movements have been developing into ways that were directly applicable and replicable into karate, right? He didn't know it. It seemed mundane. It seemed pointless. And yet he was being trained and shaped to be talented and skilled all along. Now, I hope you don't find the acts of worship pointless, okay? But sometimes they might seem mundane. Sometimes they might seem a little too repetitive or unhelpful, or maybe they feel like they don't have any purpose outside of these walls. But trust that what we do here is developing muscles of Christ-likeness that will help you live as a child of God every day of the week. that will train you in righteousness, whether you're here or not here, all along. I've got a lot of illustrations today. I think of the incredible sandstone arches out west. Anybody ever been out to Arches National Park or seen some of these things? At one point they were simply just a sandstone wall. It was just a wall inside of a canyon or something. But over time, the water and the wind has shaped them to look a certain way. The tiny drops of rain and the tiny flecks of sand whipping through the wind had chiseled at it and filed at it until it looks like this great spectacle. This rock wall has been carved out by the tiniest little things. And I wonder, what forces are having the most direct access to us? What forces are having the most direct access to us? Even the little ones, even the ones that are nearly invisible, what's shaping us? What's chiseling at us? What's carving and sculpting us? I got to say, the world gets an awful lot of time, right? The world gets an awful lot of time to have its way with how we are coming out to be. And how much time do we give God? How much time do we give God to shape who we are? Now, this is why regular spiritual disciplines through the everyday life are so important, and we've talked about that here on and off. But with this, we can't help but see that the church, the weekly gathering of God's people, is one of the most important ways that we build a Christ-like life, right? This is how it's done. We expose ourselves to the chisel and hammer of God so that He can shape us into people. We might not always see it, we might not always feel it, we might not even know it's going on. But here, in the gathering, we are transformed to be like Christ. If you're here this morning, and you're tired of where the world has taken you, you're tired of the shape the world has carved you into, and you're ready to give your life to Christ so that He might sculpt it into something so much more beautiful than you ever imagined that it could be, we invite you to take up that invitation now, to enter into the waters, to give your life to Him in baptism as we stand and as we sing.